B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Monday, September 14th, 2020. It's been a busy day in the PBC newsroom. Way too much to try to report even in an hour-long podcast. And I had to make some difficult decisions. I hope to get to some of those stories tomorrow. And by the way, I'll be off on Wednesday, taking a personal day, back on Thursday this week. So Trump has generally been ignoring California, except to take pot shots at San Francisco or L.A., and to occasionally lecture us that our wildfires are a result of failing to sweep the floors of our forests. But today, after a series of mob rallies over the weekend, including one in Nevada that was held indoors and violated local regulations, he came into Sacramento on Air Force One and dropped in at McClellan Park, which is a decommissioned Air Force base just east of our state capital. And Trump was met by Governor Newsom, not at the airport. Newsom did not come to greet him as he got off the plane, but met with him along with 4 top officials of California government. And Trump was in his kind of typical antagonistic and angry frame of mind, while at one point he did acknowledge that he would respect the differences of California. He went on to maintain his posture of denying science and denying that climate change is influenced by human behavior. So one interesting exchange took place between the Secretary for Natural Resources, Wade Crowfoot. He urged the president to acknowledge that climate change, and not just vegetation management, is a primary driver of the wildfires. Quote, "I think we want to work with you to really recognize the changing climate and what it means to our forests, and actually work together with that science. That science is going to be key, because if we ignore the science and sort of put our head in the sand and think it's all about vegetation management, we're not going to succeed together at protecting Californians." So it's clear that Governor Newsom set the tone of trying to persuade Trump and not simply attack him. But Trump's response, kind of like his treatment of the coronavirus, that we're going to wake up one day and it's just going to be gone. He responded, "It'll start getting cooler. You just watch." And Crowfoot, unbowed, said, "I wish science agreed with you." And Trump shot back, "Well, I don't think science knows, actually." And so his determined denial, his embrace of arrogance and equal parts ignorance, leave America with a very troubled situation. And Gavin Newsom spoke to Trump. "We feel very strongly the hots are getting hotter, the dries are getting drier. Something has happened to the plumbing of the world, and we come from a perspective humbly that we assert the science that climate change is real. Please respect the difference of opinion out here with respect to the fundamental issue of climate change." And Trump responded, "Absolutely." And just how much does he mean that? Moving to a report on the visit from the Los Angeles Times today, Trump deflected questions from reporters about whether climate change is a driving force behind our historic wildfires, saying instead that major fires can be attributed to what he described as a failure to properly manage the state's forests, including the need to cut more fire breaks. And as he did in 2018, after the fire that destroyed the community of Paradise, Trump said we need to do a better job clearing dead trees from the forest floor. They explode, also leaves. You have years of leaves, dried leaves on the ground. It just sets it up. It's really a fuel of a fire. So they have to do something about it. So Newsom cut short his meeting with Trump to Go to Butte County, which has been hard hit by the fires. More than 3.3 million acres have burned in California alone so far this year. 4,100 structures estimated have been destroyed. And Newsom pointed out to Trump something that's very important. California has 33 million acres of forest. 58% is owned by the federal government. The state owns merely 3%. The remainder is private property or held by local governments or others. And so Trump, just like he blames, the World Health Organization and China for his lame response to the COVID pandemic, he's always looking for somebody to point his finger at. And if he really believes that raking the forests and sweeping the floors of our national parks is so important, why doesn't he order his federal employees to take up those tasks? And, of course, he has threatened, at least on Twitter, that he would cut funding to California because we are not doing as the stable genius tells us we should do. So Joe Biden is very carefully trying to amp up his criticism of Trump. He claimed today that the hellish wildfires ravaging western states will become more frequent and more deadly if Trump wins a second term, saying that Trump has no interest in meeting this moment on climate change. And he went on to say, if we have 4 more years of Trump's climate denial, how many suburbs will be burned in wildfires? How many suburban neighborhoods will have been flooded out? How many suburbs will have been blown away in superstorms? If you give a climate arsonist 4 more years in the White House, why would anyone be surprised if we have more of America ablaze? He noted that Trump's climate denial may not have caused these fires and record floods and record hurricanes, but if he gets a second term, these hellish events will continue to become more common, more devastating, and more deadly. But I credit the political writer for the San Francisco Chronicle, Joe Garofoli, who in a front-page story on Sunday notes that Joe Biden has been passing up a chance to make fighting climate change the centerpiece of his campaign. The reason he hasn't is political. Elevating climate change into a top priority doesn't help the Democratic presidential nominee in states that are competitive in the November election, and those don't include California or Oregon because it's predictable that they will go solidly Democratic. But in swing states like Pennsylvania, where support for fracking is solid because thousands of jobs depend on it, going too green could damage Biden's slim lead. Now, on a political science level, I recognize the straddle that Biden is attempting. But as I sit here with toxic air, the thick smoke layer that continues on a daily basis here in California, that layer of ash freshly collected on the hood of my car every morning, I don't think this is a time for straddling. And Garofoli goes on, while climate change is a huge issue to Californians who are experiencing its effects with every breath, it isn't a top issue to most Americans. It was only number 11 when Pew Research asked Americans in August which topics would be very important when they cast their ballots. The top was the economy, followed by health care, Supreme Court appointments, and COVID. And I believe that leadership is what brings people along. And that maybe Pennsylvanians don't understand the severity of this, but they've had some earthquakes. Neighboring Ohio has had earthquakes caused by fracking. And as long as we are captive to the extortion that lost jobs are the reason that we continue a milquetoast approach to climate change, well, I just think that it's the wrong set of priorities. And I've worked on political campaigns. I understand the cold, hard decisions you have to make, trying to balance the interests of competing constituencies. But I don't think this represents leadership. So just to recap the situation, as many as 35 people have been reported killed in the coastal states here, California, Washington, and Oregon. At least 10 people have been killed in Oregon alone, and more are missing, though they've not said how many. The number of missing people was around 50 on Friday. That number has gone lower momentarily. But the fires continue, and while some evacuation orders have been downgraded in California as well as in Oregon, we had been teased with the prospect of a front bringing some rain to Oregon and possibly parts of Northern California later this week. But the forecasts have shifted. And now there is a new red flag warning for Northern California, especially the Butte County area, through Monday night. That is for high winds. And one of the hopes of our weather forecasters here in the Bay Area has been that increased winds and winds coming from onshore would help blow some of this toxic smoke and the fog that traps it out to sea. And, of course, that is a Hobson's choice, because while I would like to have cleaner air to breathe, I barely went out this weekend. And when I did, my eyes would sting. And the acrid air produces a low-grade headache, and I'm not a guy who gets very many headaches. So we have to balance our desire for cleaner air with our desire that we don't have high wind gusts that fan the flames even further. Authorities have warned not to expect relief soon, saying that even though winds could help disperse some of the smoke, it could also dry out brush and fan flames. Well, I think I just said that, and I quoted the lines there from the New York Times. Most of what is burned in the West has been in remote forests, but in Oregon, entire communities along Interstate 5, the main north-south artery, have been razed. We haven't had anything ever this close, said Margot Cooper, who for the last 3 decades has lived in Scio, Oregon, a farming and logging town southeast of the state capital of Salem. It's the first time it's literally in our backyard. And in Gates, Oregon, which is near Salem, refugees from the fires were exhausted after 5 days of living in dingy motels or their cars, eating donated food, and not knowing whether their homes had been burned down or were still standing. And I want to be clear that the primary cause of these fires is the lightning strikes, which are unusual for California and the West Coast in general, which hit around the 17th of August. But there have been isolated cases of arson. One man was arrested here in California and accused of arson. His efforts did not produce a major wildfire. And likewise, a man in Oregon has been arrested twice in less than 12 hours after he was accused of starting more than a half dozen small fires along a freeway. His name is Domingo Lopez, age 45, first spotted Sunday afternoon when a brush fire was lit along Interstate 205. That's east of the Portland metro area. Witnesses pointed out Lopez in a nearby tent where he was arrested in the afternoon. He was booked and then released on his own recognizance. And about 11 hours later, 3:30 a.m. Monday, Lopez was arrested a second time while walking along the side of a road, with police saying that he had started 6 more fires. He's been taken to a hospital for a mental evaluation. And the other hysteria has been generated, presumably from right-wing activists, because they claim that Antifa is responsible for starting many of these fires. There's no evidence to support that, whether by, a black bloc activist or anybody else, except for this, what appears to be a deranged guy. And this has led to many people holding back as they've been ordered to evacuate as the fire approaches. And they've grabbed their guns, and they believe they need to protect their property from Antifa looters. And one photographer who does some work for the Guardian newspaper, his name is Nathan Howard, he was on assignment east of Estacada, Oregon. I hope that's the right way of saying it. This was on Thursday when a man angrily approached him on a rural roadside. The man insisted the photographer was a looter, and despite his repeated attempts to identify himself as a journalist, the man began yelling and became so agitated that it was like his eyes were popping out of his head, said Howard. The man eventually allowed the photographer to get in his car and leave, but then a second truck approached from the opposite direction, parked horizontally across the highway, blocking both lanes. Another man climbed out of that truck, pointed a loaded assault rifle at Howard through his car's windshield, and again accused him of looting. On Friday, we reported that authorities, especially those manning the emergency 911 service, have had a wave of calls from people who believe information they get on the internet that it is Antifa or similar parties. Here's a scene in Gold Beach, which is along the coast. A Curry County Commissioner, Christopher Posh, first falsely denied that his original post said that they were Antifa. Then he added a further post discussing an unrelated fire in Gold Beach with the comment, "You think no one is lighting fires and trying to burn down towns and hurt people? Wake up," he said. Then there's a group called Cops Northwest that's featured intense discussions on a series of false stories and rumors about Antifa arsonists. And I don't know what your perception of Oregon is, but it has very liberal cities like Portland and Bend, and a whole lot of conservatives. It's very ripe Trump territory. And they appear to be buying what they hear from fellow right-wingers online. So the better news is that in Clackamas County, officials yesterday removed Level 1 evacuation notices. These are suburbs of Portland, including Wilsonville, Lake Oswego, Happy Valley, and Milwaukee. People are told to have their go bag ready and be prepared to leave on short notice. Governor Jerry Brown moonbeamed to some, the former governor of California, who did make climate change a signature issue. And as I've reported, he was a little better at the publicity than the policy. But the New York Times tracked him down. He now lives on some property that his daddy left him. It's a ranch about an hour north of Sacramento. And while the fires are not nearby the town of Williams, where his ranch is located, he said that it's shrouded in smoke. The air is extremely unhealthy. Brown said he never expected this moment to come so soon. He never thought the air around his home, which he built in the wilderness, would be this shrouded. Quote, "You might say, we're getting out of here. We're going someplace else." No, there are going to be problems everywhere in the United States. This is the new normal. It's been predicted and it's happening. This is part of the new long-term experience. "Tell me," he said, "where are you going to go? What's your alternative? Maybe Canada. You're going to go to places like Iowa where you have intensifying tornadoes? The fact is we have a global crisis that has been mounting, and the scientists have been telling us about. For the most part, it's been ignored. Now we have a graphic example. And now a tropical storm in the Gulf of Mexico has been upgraded to hurricane status and named Hurricane Sally. It is edging toward the coastline of Louisiana, Alabama, and Mississippi, and Trump can get out his Sharpie But I don't think he's going to be able to alter the path of this hurricane, which is supposed to make landfall between Tuesday and Wednesday. And they do predict that it'll bring some strong winds, but the bigger concern is heavy rain that could flood many areas along the coast. And heavy rains will deluge areas from southeast Louisiana to the Florida Panhandle, with up to 2 feet of rain in some areas. And I'll note that the money in the FEMA budget, which is needed in California, Oregon, Washington State, other western states, and again along the Gulf Coast, has been diverted to pay unemployment benefits in some states because Trump is trying to be a hero when Congress can't get its shit together. Turning to other news in London today, the extradition hearing of Julian Assange, brought by the United States, was once again interrupted. And this time it wasn't a risk of somebody testing positive for COVID. There was testimony underway being taken from an American witness named Eric Lewis, who was reportedly zooming into the hearing from Italy. And as Lewis was testifying, the sound of an American TV report on Julian Assange came through the video link and into the courtroom. And there could be some rich irony here. Because, of course, Julian Assange is accused by the United States of hacking and helping Chelsea Manning do some hacking. And one theory is that a hacker was able to wiggle into the channel that was being used to bring in Eric Lewis's testimony. And they are pursuing their IT security and hoping to resume the trial tomorrow. But it's interesting because Eric Lewis, Lewis, was being cross-examined by James Lewis, Lewis, who is the attorney for the prosecution. And so the witness, Lewis, who is described as a professional witness, he's a writer who had opposed the extradition of Julian Assange. Well, he was being peppered with questions by attorney Lewis. And he accused the witness, Lewis, of giving lengthy answers. And he's bristling at the time limits imposed by Judge Vanessa Baratzer on the attorneys. And he kind of got a little testy and was telling the judge that she has imposed a time limit that he calls a guillotine. And the judge had responded that she had asked him for a time estimate before the trial began. He said he would need 4 hours a day for cross-examination. And Barrister Lewis complained that Baratzer was allowing the defense witness, Eric Lewis, to ramble on. "I am giving a warning," Lewis said. That's the attorney. "I'm not prepared to be under a circumstance where he is allowed to give long answers. It is not how cross-examinations work." Well, it's a little payback because when the defense questions its witnesses, they are subjected to a 30-minute time limit. And Prosecutor Lewis has been able to go well beyond that in the cross-examinations up until now. So that's pretty much all we have from the courtroom at the Old Bailey today. But a related story from the World Socialist website updates us on the investigation of the Spanish spy company that was hired by the fine man, the casino owner from Las Vegas, Sheldon Adelson, to enhance the surveillance of the Ecuador embassy in London when Julian Assange was holed up there. And it's believed that that intelligence was shared by the Adelson team with the CIA. And there's an investigation underway in Spain because the surveillance firm that was hired is based in Spain. And the description of the article is that the U.S. is attempting to block this investigation. And in the strong language of the World Socialist website and its reporter Oscar Grenfell, U.S. attempts to prevent the exposure of the CIA spying are of a piece with what he describes as the biased proceedings of the extradition process. He said the surveillance is referenced in the skeleton defense argument for the current British extradition hearing. Quote, first, his lawyers were targeted for surveillance operations, and their meetings with Mr. Assange were recorded by private security agents acting on behalf of the U.S. while he was sheltering in the Ecuadorian embassy. During this time, his lawyers were under physical surveillance by these agents, and their offices were broken into. Intrusion into legal professional privilege of this nature is universally recognized as the very height of the abuse of power. And so the article goes on to report that the head of UC Global, that's the Spanish surveillance firm, a man named David Morales, he met with emissaries of the U.S. intelligence agencies in 2015, entered into an agreement to covertly surveil Assange on his behalf. He reportedly told subordinates that the firm was now playing in the Premier League, had gone over to the dark side, and was working for the American Friends without the knowledge of Ecuadorian authorities who had originally hired him for much less intrusive security. And this article also quotes the work of Max Blumenthal, who we will mention a little bit later, but it was Blumenthal who made the connection to Sheldon Adelson and his staff as those who paid Morales and UC Global for the intrusive surveillance, including the bathrooms. And at one point, they even picked up a diaper of one of Julian's children who had visited him at the embassy. Another report at the World Socialist website, this one by Shuvu Bhatta, builds on a recent Vice News report about Amazon's long-standing surveillance operations, systematically targeting and monitoring the company's own workers on private Facebook groups, with particular emphasis on posts calling for workers to organize or strike. And Amazon set up a website that, requires special passwords. The website is sharkandink.com, and that's where they compiled reports on employees that they were concerned about, including those who might be trying to organize a union. Amazon used a well-organized team called the Advocacy Operations Social Media Listening Team to monitor the posts of workers. Posts are monitored in real time through a live tool and sorted into various categories like media coverage, strikes/protests, and DP approached by researchers. DP is delivery partners, and that is a term for some of the drivers who deliver Amazon packages. So they go on to say that workers' productivity is timed by a scanner. If they're not quick enough through their tasks, they are disciplined. The delivery partners are required to deliver 999 out of every 1,000 packages on time or face termination. So these are like workhouses. Although the people appear to show up to work voluntarily for some pretty low pay, they're subjected to the kind of surveillance that you would experience in a prison. The article notes that Amazon has hired some top spooks like General Keith Alexander, former head of the National Security Agency, as well as John Barrios, a senior manager of the Global Security Operations Center at Amazon, who worked for the FBI for 11 years, and Nathan Nguyen, a manager at GSOC, former intelligence analyst for the U.S. Army. So they've called in the professional spooks to maintain order at Amazon. Over at the Gray Zone Project today, an important story by our longtime friend and colleague Gareth Porter. And he unpacks and dismantles the ongoing claims that Russia has targeted and accessed the websites of election officials across the country with bad intentions. And Porter initially reports in his article that the registered voter databases that are compiled by the states are already available to anyone in the public domain who is willing to visit the dark side of the web. And based on a report from the Russian daily newspaper Kommersant, they say a user on a dark web forum known as Gorkag offered free access to databases containing the information of 7.6 million Michigan voters, along with the state voter databases of Connecticut, Arkansas, Florida, and North Carolina. And yet we are told, as recently as last week, this time coming from Microsoft, that Russian GRU agents, the Cozy Bear, Fancy Bear teams, that they are targeting these same websites. And Porter talked to actual employees who said, well, look, we get attempted hacking on a daily basis. And we haven't seen any actual penetration. And when Porter asked I think a Homeland Security official, what would the Russians do with this information? There was no really substantive answer. And I suppose it could be part of some elaborate scheme to impersonate voters or to use their information in ways that I can't quite imagine. But as I reported, quoting the Microsoft results or comments last week, they do not allege that any of this hacking has been successful. They use words like targeting and, relentlessly trying to hack. Now, we know that goes on every day, and the U.S. is one of the leading offensive cyber warriors around the globe. Also at The Intercept today, an interesting story about how Operation Legend, that's Trump's deployment of his federal goon squads to cities. It's a package that comes with enhanced surveillance tools. The article opens with a scene in Memphis where 40 federal agents were deployed in August as part of Operation Legend, and that these temporary assigned federal officers will relocate by November, but they will leave behind a city flush with grant money for local police and heightened surveillance capabilities. And primarily, they're using these systems that are gunshot monitors. They put microphones all across a city, and these sensors will deliver a signal to a war room in the police department saying that this is where a gunshot came from. And I actually thought that this is kind of technology that it would at least help pinpoint the geographical location of where a gunshot came from. But according to this article, there is no indication that these systems really are effective, and that based on tests in St. Louis, that the deployment of the shot spotter technology had no impact on violent crime whatsoever. According to a professor at Southern Illinois University, Dennis Mayer, the results were essentially it doesn't work. Also, they use license plate readers to attempt to track down the vehicles of people who are suspects in crime. And these are intrusive surveillance tools. They operate in public where courts have ruled that an average citizen doesn't have an expectation of privacy. But I think they're an unwarranted incursion on our Fourth Amendment rights. Meanwhile, more than 24 progressive groups have signed a letter to Congress urging, particularly Democrats, not to renew the portion Section 215 of the USA Patriot Act. Now, it expired earlier this year, and Democrats have worked hard to try to tag it onto other bills that must pass. We don't see Republicans, at least not in an organized manner, trying to reinstate these surveillance authorities. So I'm grateful to the ACLU, Demand Progress, Freedom of the Press Foundation, the NAACP, and the other groups that have signed on to this letter. In Los Angeles on Sunday, there was an effort by an unknown lone gunman to execute 2 members of the L.A. County Sheriff's Department. They were seated in a vehicle in Compton outside a commuter rail station. And the video, which is a little bit fuzzy, shows that a single individual walked up to their SUV, and as he or she got closer, extended the right arm with a gun, firing 2 shots to the heads of these deputies. Both are expected to survive, but once again, this becomes fodder for Trump and his law and order campaign. So Trump called for the unknown shooter to receive the death penalty. That would be what we used to call a premature ejaculation. And let me be very explicit about my position. I don't condone this kind of violence against police officers. But we do need to look at the context. And to its credit, the LA Times, in reporting on this incident, in paragraph 3, cites a longtime South LA activist named Najee Ali, who first said that he understands the anger, joined in condemning the shooting, but he questioned why such swift calls for justice don't come when it's the police who cause the injuries. Ali is quoted, "I don't agree with the shooting of anyone that's unjustified, including deputies, but also civilians." And he said he plans to join other black leaders this week to stand in full solidarity in condemning these actions. And again, crediting the Times, they contextualize this event properly, noting that this sheriff's department, where deputies have just recently been accused of running their own gangs, the sheriff himself has been accused of harassment and mismanagement. We've seen shootings like the one of the man on a bicycle. We still haven't been told what vehicle code section that he violated on his bicycle that required the cops to pull him over. There's the incident of the young Hispanic man who was a security guard at a body shop. He ran when the cops approached, and they ran him down and killed him. And these are just 2 recent examples. I believe there have been 7 police-involved shootings, mostly fatal, by the L.A. County Sheriff's Department this year alone. And the sheriff himself, Alex Villanueva, he is blaming the anti-police messaging of recent protests. And this is disingenuous and hypocritical because he runs an organization where they've been very slow to deploy body cameras. I don't believe there were cameras on in any of these recent incidents that I've described. And he also is very slow in investigating and is hardly transparent. And I am not in any way condoning or rationalizing the targeted execution of police officers. But the context is very important. And Trump and, in a different manner, Biden, both ignore the context and simply reach for their interpretation of justice and say it should be applied before there's been any investigation into this case to better understand what occurred. Now, right-wingers have also seized on a handful of protesters who went to the hospital where the two police officers were sent for surgery. And while it is distasteful that protesters gathered and shouted things like, "I wish the motherfuckers would die," that there was no excuse that they brutalized and then arrested a journalist from a local public radio station who was there covering these protests at the hospital. And even when it's offensive and tasteless, I support the rights of these individuals to utter those offensive and tasteless comments. So in a separate incident, the one in Portland that was almost 2 weeks ago, where the alleged member of Antifa, and they don't have members, they have people who identify with a murky group, but his name was Rhinowell, Michael Rhinowell. And he is accused of pulling out a gun and shooting Patriot Prayer protester Jay Danielson, who was about to hit him with pepper spray. And so Trump went on Fox Saturday night with the ever empathetic Judge Jeanine Pirro. And Trump is bragging about how he leaned on the U.S. Marshals. He said, "When are you going to get him?" And as you may know, within a few days, they located Rhinowell in southern Washington state. And get this quote from Trump. "And the U.S. Marshals went in to get him. And in a short period of time, it ended in a gunfight. This guy was a violent criminal, and the U.S. Marshals killed him. I will tell you something. That's the way it has to be. There has to be retribution when you have a crime like this." Now, he is suggesting extrajudicial killing. And in this account from the Oregonian newspaper based in Portland, they cite an eyewitness who was at the apartment complex where the U.S. Marshals Task Force located Rhinowell. And this eyewitness, Nate Dingus, he put out a statement last week saying he didn't see Rhinowell pull a gun when officers began firing at him. He said officers didn't appear to issue any commands or orders to him. Rhinowell was heading to his car while eating a candy bar and holding a cell phone. The night of the shooting, the marshals issued a statement that said initial reports indicate the suspect produced a firearm threatening the lives of law enforcement officers. Task force members responded to the threat and struck the suspect, who was pronounced dead at the scene. Now, he was a suspect. They may have believed firmly that he was responsible for the shooting in Portland. But he had the right of presumption of innocence, and they gunned him down, apparently, without him threatening them in any way. And Trump piles on and approves of this as some form of vengeance. And these are such dangerous prevarications from previous standards where a president wouldn't comment in any detail. He might deplore an event like the attempted execution of the cops in Los Angeles, But a rational president wouldn't then jump to advocacy of the death penalty, or in this case, retribution, a cold-blooded killing. But Trump rationalizes this because one of his people was the victim. But when unarmed black men are victims of police brutality, violence, and shooting, he says they're good people. Good people on both sides. All right, we have more cases. A sheriff's deputy in Georgia has been fired after he was captured on video repeatedly punching a black man during a traffic stop. The deputy was fired for excessive use of force from the Clayton County Sheriff's Department. A black man, Roderick Walker, 26, was arrested and beaten last Friday after deputies pulled over the vehicle he was riding in with his girlfriend, along with their 5-month-old child and his stepson. Now, they didn't even own the car they were riding in. They'd paid a guy $10 to take them home after they had dropped off a rental car. And the cops alleged that the driver had a broken taillight on his car. But the driver wasn't even cited. And Roderick Walker was the subject of a police demand that he get out of the car. And he said, what do you want me for? I'm not driving. So it was captured on video by a bystander. Shows 2 deputies on top of Walker, one repeatedly punching him. His girlfriend screams and tells the deputies Walker said he can't breathe. A child in the vehicle yells, "Daddy." Then Walker is handcuffed. The deputy who punched him tells the bystander that Walker had bit him. Walker's attorney said his client denies biting the deputy. Walker was trying to survive and lost consciousness at least twice during the beating, and his booking photo showed a big welt and swelling under his left eye. And his lawyer said, "My reaction to the video is it shows, unfortunately, another incident where an African-American male's civil rights have been violated by people and officers and law enforcement who have the first duty to serve and protect." Now to Pennsylvania, Sunday afternoon. A police officer fatally shot a man during a domestic disturbance call. 27-year-old Ricardo Munoz. According to a video from the officer's body camera, was chasing the officer down a sidewalk with a knife. And the officer fired several shots while running away. This is in Lancaster, or do you say Lancaster, Pennsylvania. The district attorney has asked people to remain calm. There were protests that broke out almost immediately. And I want to recommend, if you have any interest in this, the city of Vallejo is a former Navy town. There was a base there for many years, right across the bay from me, about 25 miles from where I sit. And I want to commend Otis R. Taylor, Jr. He's been a guest on our podcast. He is a columnist for the San Francisco Chronicle, and he's a black reporter who is prone to cover issues affecting black citizens. So he opens his report by talking about a woman named Delon Thurston, who sometimes drives home from work wearing plastic gloves. She's a massage therapist. Her hands get worn out, and so she puts an herbal mix on her hands and then puts the gloves on. But in October of 2018, when she was driving home with her gloves on, an officer who said, well, you know, a lot of car thieves drive with gloves on so they don't leave fingerprints on a stolen car. So he followed her to her apartment complex, and he stopped her for allegedly making an improper turn into her own driveway, maybe without signaling. Next, she was pulled from the car, pushed to the ground, inappropriately fondled through her clothing by a female officer during a pat-down search. And so Ms. Thurston has gotten in line with many others to sue the city of Vallejo. Now, this is a community that is diverse, 30% white, 25% Asian, 22% black, 20% Latino. But 69% of the cops are white. Only 7 are black. And in 2018, almost half of the 2,300 people arrested by Vallejo police were black. There's much more to this story. It goes on for a couple of pages. But I commend the Chronicle for devoting the space to an important investigation, and to Otis R. Taylor, Jr. for taking on a complicated story with a lot of uncooperative sources, mostly the official sources, the police. Every day I pause for a second to thank the people who support my work here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast, including people like Billy Cook, Terry Paris, Anthony Sassone, and Brian Carey. They all chip in $5 or $10 a month, and you can do it too. It supports my work, helps me pay subscriptions to the LA Times, the Washington Post, and the Seattle Times these days. And I appreciate it if you log on at peterbcollins.com/sign up. Now I want to identify one other person who's a very generous supporter of this podcast, and that's Paul L. Sesser. And Paul emailed me some questions this morning that I included in my interview with Max Blumenthal. And as I mentioned on Friday, Max published a 10,000-word investigative report on what he calls the green billionaires who work to suppress and censor the documentary Planet of the Humans that was produced by Michael Moore and directed by Jeff Gibbs, released on Earth Day in April of this year. Blumenthal follows the money and identifies the people on the climate activist side who receive funding from an array of wealthy foundations and individuals. Many of those individuals are using their wealth to advance their interests in profiting from responses to climate change, renewable energy, other policies. And it's a fascinating conversation. It runs about an hour. And I'm releasing it to my subscribers today at peterbcollins.com, iTunes, TuneIn, Spreaker, and Stitcher. And in this excerpt from the interview, Max Blumenthal talks about the interests of the people who tried to censor a documentary that we agree is flawed in some identifiable ways. But still, the thrust of it is a critique of the climate movement that deserves to be heard.
I interviewed Ozzie Zenner several times just to ask him about his research, and then I wanted to check his research, and I found that it really did add up and that there was so much more there. But I got the sense that they felt blindsided by the attack, which should have been expected, and that Michael Moore, I mean, he's in a different category than the co-producers of the film who did all the work on the film. Essentially what Moore did, I think, was he kind of put up some resources and put his name on it, so that, which made the film a real threat. But you look at the situation Michael Moore's in, look at the atmosphere that he exists in. It's the same atmosphere where Susan Sarandon gets ritually sacrificed and pilloried every week because she didn't go along with the Democratic Party in 2016. The Democratic Party has become this vicious authoritarian apparatus that tears anyone to shreds and eats them alive if they refuse to go along with the hideous, ossified, octogenarian, zombie droid, warmongering Wall Street tool that they nominate. And that's what Michael Moore, I think, has to deal with. So I think he kind of backed away once he realized, oh, shit, I made an anti-capitalist film that actually threatens very powerful interests that are deeply entrenched, not just within the Democratic Party, but within its progressive wing, and are represented by figures like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. So when Michael Moore goes out there and defends the film, he's praising many of the people that the film criticizes or implicitly criticizes, like Greta Thunberg, who is presented as the Joan of Arc of our time by, all of the foundation and billionaire interests that want to cash in on renewables.
That's Max Blumenthal, who is the founder and editor of the Gray Zone Project. And I encourage you to listen to the full interview and consider the arguments that he offers. We have other news, too. This is from Alan McLeod at the Mint Press News site today. And what he reports is that Democrats have taken up some interesting forms of voter suppression. They are attempting to remove Green Party presidential candidate Howie Hawkins from the ballot because of an alleged procedural mistake by his running mate, Angela Walker, when she moved her house or her home from one location in South Carolina to another. And she says, look, I notified the change of address properly, and now Democrats are trying to use what they see as a technical error to bounce us from the ballot in two key states, Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. And I deplore this in the strongest possible way. This is an effort by Democrats to eliminate what they consider to be unwanted competition. And it's not enough for them to persuade people not to vote third party, to fall in line and support Joe Biden. They want to make it impossible by using and abusing the legal process. And in Colorado, a federal judge late on Saturday temporarily blocked the Postal Service from delivering a notice about the November elections to any more people in Colorado, finding that the mailer provides patently false information about the state's voting system that could sow confusion among voters. The ruling arrived hours after the state filed a response, which urges postal customers to request your mail-in ballot at least 15 days before the election day. Now, on the face of it, it seems to be benign. But the Secretary of State of Colorado, Gina Griswold, said the situation is beyond suspect. She accused the Postal Service of rejecting feedback on the mailer from Secretaries of State and argued that it would suppress votes and undermine public confidence in the election if it's sent to all Colorado voters. Now, the judge, William Martinez, in the U.S. District Court for Colorado, granted the state's request for a temporary restraining order against the mailer. It does create a challenge for the Postal Service, but it's not too hard for them to just notify each mail carrier that if this ends up in your sorting stack, you put it aside and you put it in this box over here, and we'll deliver it to the court. Anyway, the judge said, echoing the Secretary of State, that the mailer provides false or misleading information about the manner of Colorado's elections and that the state will suffer irreparable harm if this notice is delivered to Colorado households. Here's today's COVID-19 update, prepared by Linda Lewis. As of this date, we have a report of 6.5 million cases across the United States, and the death count attributed to COVID is up to 194,000. Worldwide, the caseload is at 29 million, and total deaths 925,000. The AP reports that coronavirus infections in the Dakotas are growing faster than anywhere else in the nation. Infections at universities and the Sturgis motorcycle rally are blamed for this rise. Over 1,000 students at the four largest universities have left campus to quarantine after being exposed to the virus, according to data released by the schools. The Sturgis rally also spread infections across the region, with health officials in 12 states reporting over 300 cases among people who attended the event. Dr. Anthony Fauci said that the virus level Dr. Anthony Fauci says that the virus levels are disturbing. He warned against starting the higher-risk fall season with a baseline that high. Governors of both states have resisted mask requirements or not planning to change their policies. In Texas, conflicting data has heightened distrust of government. The New York Times reports on the problem of conflicting virus data in Texas. Quote, the state has overlooked thousands of cases only to report them weeks after infection. It has made major adjustments to its case and death counts, defining them one way and then another, suddenly reporting figures for some counties that were vastly different from those posted by the local health department. And this is just part and parcel of what I've been complaining about for months, that we cannot rely on the data. And now that they are being massaged through a private firm in Pennsylvania, Pittsburgh, I believe, we have to be even more skeptical. Public health officials in Texas place the blame for the state's data problems on antiquated data systems and a reliance on faxed test results, which limit the state's ability to track every infection and death in many of its 254 counties. Adding to the problem, the different state and local health departments don't report cases uniformly. In late July, Texas started basing its counts on death certificates filed with the state instead of gathering figures from local health department websites, which often rely on reports from hospitals and physicians. The change was intended to make the tallies for all counties consistent, but it apparently has produced the opposite. And the case count differences raised doubts among the public, according to Annette Rodriguez, health director for the Corpus Christi County Public Health District, which reported 4,000 more cases in its county than the state did as of Friday. Democrats on the House Oversight Committee are investigating reports of attempted Trump administration political interference with CDC scientific reports. Led by Congressman James Clyburn, they cited reporting from Politico that showed administration appointees have repeatedly interfered with CDC reports. And the two key figures are a guy named Michael Caputo, who Trump installed at the Health and Human Services Department in April, and his so-called science advisor, a guy named Paul Alexander. And they have been accused by the rank-and-file scientists at the CDC of repeatedly interfering, delaying, and demanding changes in their reports. And Caputo in particular was the subject of reporting over the weekend. The New York Times described how reports on morbidity and mortality have been frequently delayed with demands to revise, delay, or scuttle these reports. And Caputo went off in a Facebook Live presentation on Sunday. Apparently he does this weekly. But he accused those career government scientists of sedition in their handling of the pandemic, and he warned separately that left-wing hit squads were preparing for armed insurrection after the election. Now, I don't know how the second part there relates to his duties, but Caputo is the Assistant Secretary of Public Affairs at HHS. He said that the Centers for Disease Control was harboring a resistance unit determined to undermine Trump. And then he went kind of paranoid. He said, you understand that they're going to have to kill me, and unfortunately, I think that's where this is going. Caputo said today, since joining the administration, my family and I have been continually threatened and harassed by people who have later been prosecuted. This weighs heavily on us, and we deeply appreciate the friendship and support of President Trump. And then Caputo later said, I don't like being alone in Washington. Describing the shadows on the ceiling in my apartment, they're alone. Shadows are so long. Then he ran through a series of conspiracy theories culminating in a prediction that Trump will win, but Joe Biden will refuse to concede. And when Trump refuses to stand down at the inauguration, the shooting will begin. I mean, this is really unhinged, coming from a guy who is supposed to be a professional communications guy. Wow. The New York Times reports a growing outcry among independent scientists and public health experts for more transparency in the COVID vaccine trials. None of the three companies with coronavirus vaccines in advanced clinical trials in the U.S. have made public the protocols and statistical analysis plans for these trials. Last week, the public learned that a volunteer in the AstraZeneca trial had experienced serious neurological symptoms. But we learned that from an independent news source, Stat News, not from the company or its chief executive. AstraZeneca didn't initially report that a participant's illness had halted its clinical trials. The studies were paused a week ago Sunday, but not reported until the news was broken by STAT last Tuesday. And the company still has not disclosed the patient's illness that led to the pause, even though it has discussed the medical condition of another participant who developed multiple sclerosis in July. And AstraZeneca said that it will resume its vaccine trials in Great Britain. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast today. You're free to share it all over the dang place. You'll find it on YouTube. And as Roy Rogers serenades us into the sunset, I remain Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails.